again a paper about gender differences in math, and it is focused on primary schools in Italy. And this is a joint, I'm Federico Rigo from the University of Bergamo, as I said before, and this is a joint work with other two colleagues, Annalisa Cristini and Pierabello. And we are all economists, so we use, we try to use a causal inference approach like the one that Enrico Rettore tried to explain a few minutes earlier. So we started working on this paper because, as we have already heard from the previous presentation, in almost all the OECD countries we observe gaps, gender gaps in students' performance at different grades. Even if for maths, these differences are quite different across different countries. But in the case of Italy, it is clear, as we have already heard, that the gender gaps in mathematics actually increases over time. And this also influences quite strongly educational choices later in life, and also what kind of jobs that women can do later. And we believe, and in our country there is a huge debate about the role of gender stereotypes, as the title of this session, in influencing gender gaps in mathematics, and specifically how girls perform in maths. And part of these cultural stereotypes actually are very pervasive, and they start very early in life of our children, because, for example, they depend on the type of toys that we propose to girls compared to boys, or to the type of sports, or also to the type of family chores or housework that we ask our children to do when they are young. So starting from these stylized effects and this idea of the role of gender stereotypes, what we do in this paper is to start from some literature that already has investigated the effect of gender stereotypes and teachers' stereotypes in influencing the gender gaps in education. And there is particularly a paper by Carlana that is focused on these stereotypes in the case of teachers and how they influence the performance of students in middle schools in Italy. There is also some literature looking at the effect of how stereotypes about different occupations can influence how girls and boys make their choices at the end of high schools, and then their future careers in the labor market. While we think that little is known on these aspects related to primary education. It's true that from the data, the gender gap in math in primary schools is much smaller than later in the educational life of our children. But nonetheless, it is in primary school that our children start developing some ideas and beliefs about their skills and their preferences also. And it's also true that it is in primary school that both teachers and parents are particularly important as role models in influencing them what our children believe about their skills in different subjects, and then what they can eventually do later in their life. So in this paper, what we want to do is to try to address these two main questions. So is there a gender gap in pupil performance in elementary schools? And we will focus both on math and reading, but most of our discussion will be then on math. And then, if there is this gap, what is the role of teachers' gender stereotypes in influencing the gender gap in math versus reading? Now, probably this has been already discussed in the previous session on gender stereotypes. I'm not a psychologist, so I apologize with the psychologists here if I'm not so super perfect in explaining these issues. But if you look at least at the socioeconomic literature that try to measure stereotypes, usually there are three main types of approaches. So either you try to elicit stereotypes using some sort of item-based questions. So for example, you ask people to tell their opinion about statements like the ones that you can read here. So for example, when jobs are scarce, men should have more right to have a job rather than women. Or if a woman earns more money than her husband, it's almost certain to cause problems. These are standard questions that you can find also in international surveys like the European Value Survey or the World Value Surveys, for example. And the people and respondents have to say on using a Likert scale, for example, with 5 different levels, what is their opinion about these questions. Of course, if you think of teachers, especially in primary schools, also given the social norms and their role in our society, it's very unlikely that teachers say that they agree with these kind of questions. Okay, so if you try to use this approach to elicit stereotypes and gender stereotypes, particularly with primary teachers, probably this is not the best approach. Anyhow, this is used in the literature, and we will use that as well in our paper. A second approach is to use the so-called double difference method. So in most of our countries, we have some standardized test, like the INVALSI test, which is evaluated with a blind approach. So the evaluator doesn't know who is the child that is evaluated. But on the other side, we also have the teacher's marks, which can be influenced by gender stereotypes. And the double difference method actually computed the difference between the teachers' non-blind scores and the blind scores from standardized test, and if there is any difference between them, this should be due or can be due to gender stereotypes. And finally, a third approach is the one from psychology, which is the one that tries to also to elicit the so-called implicit stereotypes. So it may be the case that I don't know that because I was born in a context, in a cultural and social context in which it is common to have different gender roles. And then even as a teacher, even if I explicitly declare that I don't make any difference between girls and boys, then given the kind of context in which I was born and in which I work, I tend to actually use these kind of stereotypes in a sort of unconscious way. And there are many tests to measure this kind of implicit stereotypes. One that has been used mainly in the economic literature is the so-called implicit association test. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but probably most of you know that, and it's simply based on the speed in which you associate different concepts. For example, to measure gender stereotypes, this kind of tests measure the speed that you use to associate, for example, female names with science or with humanities issues. So here there is a preview of our, or actually in the literature, regardless actually in a certain way of how the stereotypes are measured, usually they find a positive association between gender gaps in math especially and the teachers' stereotypes. And usually these stereotypes are against women. So if you observe a larger gender gaps, it's because women and girls tend to underperform when they have a stereotyped teacher compared to a situation in which the teacher is less stereotyped. So our analysis actually is built on these two main papers. I will not spend too much on this because as you will see in our analysis, we will try to bridge the main advantages of these two approaches. So basically what we do in our paper is to focus on primary education, as the paper by Sule told, that was based on the Turkish education system. We measure teachers' implicit and explicit gender stereotypes, which is the same approach used by Karlana, while in the paper on the Turkish educational system they measured only explicit gender stereotypes. we can also observe the number of years that a pupil stays with the same teacher. So we call this the exposure to stereotypes. So for example, for children in the 5th grade, we know whether they had the same math or the same reading teacher for the entire primary school. And finally, we also have some information on teachers' characteristics, and especially we know some information about their type of education, and we see whether there is an effect of the teacher's education in influencing the effect of their stereotypes on pupils' achievement. So here is the preview of our main findings, if I don't have time to reach the end of my presentation. So actually we find, as we have seen in the previous paper, that gender stereotypes, or actually math gaps, or gender gaps in math increases going from the 2nd to the 5th grade. But we find that gender stereotypes are more important in influencing the gender gap in math, especially in the 2nd grade. They look less important, at least in our estimates, they are less precisely estimated in the case of the 5th grade. And what it is interesting is that in our case, the effect of the gender stereotypes in the 2nd grade are due not really, or not only to the fact that if you are a girl and you have a stereotyped teacher, you perform worse, but it's more the other way around. So it looks like that if you are so lucky in a certain way to have an unconventional teacher. So for example, a math teacher that associates girls' names more to science, then in that case you perform much better than when you have, let's say, a more stereotyped teacher that associates more girls to humanities. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Italian educational system. Until a few years ago, you could become a teacher only with a high school diploma, and there was a special school for teachers. We call this the pedagogical high school in our analysis. Nowadays, you have to graduate to get a bachelor, and then also to get other additional training. And we see in our data whether having this kind of pedagogical training is relevant, and the answer is yes. So if you are a teacher who had a specific who attended a pedagogical high school, that seems to reduce the effect of your stereotypes on the student's performance. So actually we used INVALSI data in our analysis, but the process to collect the data was actually very demanding, because this idea started at the end of the COVID period in a sort of local table made of women in the province of Bergamo that was called the table of women who wanted to, let's say, relaunch the economy at the local level. So this is a kind of translation from Italy of the original name. At this table there were all the different local administrations and local institutions, including the local school office. And we started discussing about, these differences in performance of students, and so the local school offices supported our project, and actually the local school office sent a letter to all the primary schools of the province, asking them if they wanted to participate to a project whose aim was to try to understand the role of gender stereotypes in influencing the students' achievement. So we then organized a call with the principals. So we started this project at the end of 2021. At the beginning of 2022, we had the first official call with all the principals, in which we explained the aim of the project and what we needed from them. We explained this idea of this implicit association test, that teachers had to participate, and so on. And so the principals then explained to all their teachers the idea of the project, and we could carry out the field analysis, so asking the teachers to fill out, to participate to the implicit association test, and also to fill out a questionnaire between the end of April and June 2022. And then we asked the school principals also to sign a disclosure to allow us to match the information we could get from the teacher side with the INVALSI test. And from this point of view, we have, of course, to thank Patrizia Giannantoni and Patrizia Falzetti for their really incredible work that they did to allow us to match this data. Now, this is the map of the different municipalities in the province of Bergamo, and the orange ones are the ones in which we have schools in our final sample. So the total number of primary state schools in the province is a bit more than 300. 40 schools actually participated to the project. And going back to Rettore's comment about how, or Richie's comment, how to ask teachers to be involved, I think that the role of the principal is fundamental. So the schools who accepted to participate to our project were those in which the principal clearly understood that studying this issue was crucial for how to manage better the schools. The total number of primary school teachers in the province is around 500. We could have in our sample a bit less than 200, so around 40%. And we had then to match these teachers with the corresponding classes for the INVALSI test, so the 2nd and the 5th grade. And hence we could match information for teachers with around 2,600 students. And as you can see, the sample of students is not so high, but again, it was very difficult to get this kind of information. Now, these are simple summary statistics. The first table reports the summary statistics for teachers, distinguishing teachers of language, Italian language or humanities, and teachers on math and science, while the second table is related to students. So for example, as you can see, looking at the characteristics of teachers, teachers in humanities are more likely to have a bachelor degree, and they are less likely to have a pedagogical high school diploma. The number of years in the same class is pretty much the same, around 3 out of 5 years. If you think of the 5th grade, of course, teachers in math are a bit older, and so on and so forth. And actually it's interesting to see the average IEAT score, so the average implicit association test score, which is a bit higher for humanities teachers compared to math ones, which means that the higher is the score, the higher is the association between girls' names and humanities. So from our sample, it seems that teachers in humanities are more gender stereotyped than math ones, and this also comes out from the Carlana's paper for teachers in middle schools. Now, regarding students, I think that it is more interesting to check what are the average characteristics of our sample with the overall population in the province. So basically the share of girls is more or less the same. It's quite interestingly to see that actually the share of children who attended also a nursery school or a preschool is much lower in our sample than in the population. We have a higher share of foreigners, and also the, let's say, parental background is more disadvantaged in our sample compared to the overall one, to the population. But in terms of the average math and reading test score, there are no statistically significant differences between the two, between our sample and the population. But on the whole, this table tells us that our sample actually is more related probably to a more disadvantaged population of students compared to the entire province. Here are some statistics about differences by gender in the math and reading test score. I will not spend too much on this because the results are the same as the ones in the previous paper. So actually we do not find any statistically significant differences, neither in math nor in reading test scores in the second grade, while we do have, or we start seeing some statistically significant differences in both tests, in favor of boys for math and in favor of girls for reading. And what it is interesting, we can also attach information about the same test for the same students in the 5th grade when they were in the 2nd grade, and actually, as you can see here, no statistical difference appears. So it's not a cohort effect, it's a life cycle effect. Here is the distribution of the implicit association test score by subject for the teachers, and again, the red curve is for humanities, the blue one for math, and as you can see, the distribution of the test for humanities is more on the right, meaning again that the teachers in humanities are more stereotyped than those in math. Now, what we do then with all this data? So we want to estimate what is the effect of the gender, the teachers' stereotypes on the gender gap in reading and math, and we use two different estimation strategies. I don't want to spend too much time on the technical details, but what we do actually is first, with the first approach, we estimate whether the gender gap in math is influenced by the level of the test for the implicit stereotypes of the teacher. And we exploit the fact that students in the Italian educational system are randomly assigned to different classes once the family chooses the school. So you can choose the school for your children, but then if you are in class A or class B, this is not a choice that as a family you can manage and hence, or manipulate, and hence the association between your child and the teacher is as good as random, I would say, like talking about observational studies. So here we see whether the gender stereotypes of the teacher influences the gender gap. While with this second strategy, we estimate whether students in the same gender have different performance in different classes because they are different teachers. So this second approach allows to disentangle what I tried to explain before. So if I observe, for example, that the higher is the gender stereotype, the higher is the gender gap, with the second approach I try to see whether this is due to girls doing worse, for example in mathematics, or men doing even better than before. This is the idea. Now, these are all the estimates. Probably you cannot really read everything. Here we pull all the observations together. The coefficient of interest is this one. So when we use all the students together, 2nd and 5th grade, we do not find any effect of, any differential effect by gender of the teacher stereotypes on students' performance, not in math nor even in reading. While when we split the sample between the 2nd and the 5th grade, we actually see that if you are a girl and you have a teacher who is a stereotype, this actually reduces even more your math score, which means that having a teacher who has some implicit gender stereotypes increases the gender gap in math. And this is true, as you can see, or in our case, our estimate is statistically significant only for the 2nd grade. Now, what we did then is to see how the level of the gender of the implicit stereotypes influences the different math score, in this case, for boys and for girls. So here you read the test, the AIT test. The higher, the more stereotyped you are. And here is the predicted math score for girls and for boys in our sample. And as you can see here, what it is clear is that if you are a girl and you have a teacher who's not stereotyped, so what we call an unconventional teacher, you do much better than having a teacher who is stereotyped. And this is also true compared to men. So this is the idea that that drives our conclusion that the gender gap in math is influenced by implicit stereotypes, but if you are a girl and you have a teacher who's not stereotyped, this can improve your performance a lot. Then we run a number of robustness checks, but I think I'm running out of time. Finally, what we did is to interact the teacher's stereotype, as I said in my introduction, also with the teacher's field of study. So we distinguish teachers with a pedagogical high school, the so-called magistrale in Italy, versus the others. And also we distinguish teachers who are graduated from the others. And we find that having a pedagogical background actually reduces the effect of the implicit gender stereotypes on the gender gap in math. But on the other side, we find that having a graduated teachers actually reduces the effect of the gender stereotypes in grade 5. So now we have to try to explain why this is the case, but this is just a result that we found a few days before coming here, so we're still working on this. And if you have some hints or comments, of course, are welcome. And here are the conclusion that simply summarizes what I discussed before.